we have a super, super fun panel for you now. Just one of the ones I'm most excited about because, a lot of what we're talking about today is practical, and we're practical guys. We want all this to work. So in my presentation, I showed you guys some pictures of Hans Moravec and Hayek, and that's because we like to talk about philosophy, right? We like to think about the big picture, where are things going, and so this next panel that we're about to do is called what I'm calling designing, or rather, let's call it evolving, even better, evolving the Platonic ideal of the grid. Obviously, we have a grid as it stands today, but just because we have something doesn't mean that's the best something, right? So I wanted to get 4 of my favorite thinkers. Each of these guys, they may look unassuming, but there's some really big brains up here. So I'm excited to have them all in conversation to think, what could a grid look like, right? So gentlemen, if each of you could maybe give 30 seconds really quickly, who you are, why you're excited about this topic, and why you think maybe I would put you in the Hans Moravec and Hayek category up here. So, and you want to make sure everyone get your mic on.
Mic is on.
Check 1, 2.
Cool. Thanks, Max. Yeah. My name's Kyle Baranko. I lead product at Paces, where I've been there for about 3 years. We are focused on increasing the success rate of energy infrastructure projects. So currently about like 70 to 90% of these projects fail. So what we're focused on is taking all of the messy data across, interconnection, permitting, environmental, the built environment, and trying to go as deep as we can from a data perspective to take those risks and surface them up at the outset of the development process. I think, my journey to this point has been working for a couple different energy startups. One of which was really focused on selling to utilities. Another was playing around in demand response markets and aggregation. And now I'm very focused on siting and development, and which takes me deep into interconnection. But I studied political economy in school, and I think thinking through a lot of the incentive models and how that governs a lot of the practical realities of how we do business on the grid has been something I've tried to reflect on and think about through my couple different stints in the industry. So.
And just Kyle is a phenomenal Substack. What's it called?
Grand Prismatic.
Grand Prismatic. That's how I found him, talking about fractal grids. Big brain right here. Okay.
Hey, everybody. My name is Sam Brandin. I'm one of the co-founders of Agentic Infrastructure. Agentic Infrastructure is a powered land industrial campus developer, corely focused on Texas at the moment. Ultimately, really focused on delivering an uncompromising experience for some of these AI data center loads that want to come in, at unprecedented scale at single locations on an unprecedented timeline with premium reliability. And then we want to deliver it at lowest cost. And so me and my co-founder, we come from a career of focusing on standalone transmission scale energy storage. We have about 1.7 gigawatts of operating projects from our past shops, and 1.1 gigawatts of that is in Texas. So have a lot of, I live in Denver myself, but I always say I have a lot of secondhand pride for Texas, given, how much it really encapsulates everything, we should be proud about in America with respect to free markets. And otherwise, just generally focused on capacity optimization and how to, Peter Thiel has a great phrase that's always, we can always do more with more. We can always do less with less. The goal is to do more with less. And so that's exactly what capacity optimization is for the wholesale power system. And I think there's, it's a phenomenally exciting moment for the space.
And I met Sam on Twitter. He has some of the absolute best takes in the entire energy industry. SL Brandon, like this guy, he knows what's up.
Hi, everyone. I'm John. Probably the least familiar with the grid on this panel. I'm coming more from the compute markets and probably economic background. My, curriculum of disillusionment with the traditional system began when I was working at the White House during the global financial crisis. So kind of have more of a kind of economics market take. By day, I guess I'm predominantly an investor, but have been working on an incubation with a few friends of mine who were on the original TPU team at Google, and then built the TPU fungibility layer there. And so it kind of dovetails with a lot of Tomas's thoughts that he was bringing up. Tomas is actually an advisor at the company about implementing a more sort of cost, and it goes hand in hand with that energy aware inference in a sort of distributed edge fabric. So I probably bring a little more of a market compute sort of economics bent to this panel than other folks, but happy to share my thoughts on that.
And one fun fact, I don't know if we could say this, but you went to school with someone who's into markets. I don't know if we can talk about that.
Well, my advisor in school was Professor Scholes, who created
I was thinking elementary school.
Oh, yeah. I went to the same elementary school as Ross Ulbricht. I'm from Texas originally, and
If anyone knows what that means,
yeah,
that's
I
a good
guess
deal.
I do have a lot of grid adjacencies. A lot of my biggest LPs in the fund are some of the largest E&P developers in the Permian, Eagleford, and actually the North Slope too. And then another fun fact is my college roommate is Trump's new EIA administrator, so he's struggling with a lot of these kind of grid conundrums 1 month into the job there.
Nice.
Hey everyone, Andrew Myers, CEO at Satoshi Energy. The thing that really excites me and gets me up in the morning is thinking about how to build a global power grid, ideally a decentralized power grid. And I think right now, kind of towing the line between building the matrix and building a decentralized hive mind. So when I met Max for the first time, and his LinkedIn profile was something around like Bitcoin, solar, and building the hive mind, I was like, wow, another one of me exists.
Much love. Cool. Okay, so each of you guys, we could take this in a lot of directions. And since it's a big panel, I would say maybe just like we'll try and be pithy in some of our thoughts on this. But when you think about the grid as it stands today, if you were starting from scratch, what is the biggest difference that you would like to push for? I know some of you guys have thought about things like fractal grids and how that can scale, things like DC versus AC. Maybe for each of you, what is the single biggest thing, if you could wave a magic wand, you could build, in Abilene, a 10 gigawatt, data center and build a grid out from that? What would you like to see different from how the grid works today? Whoever wants to start.
No takers. I was going to say no politicians is number one. But kind of tongue in cheek there, there's a saying that you might not be interested in politics, but politics is interested in you. So there's obviously a lot of political pushback, I would say local economic pushback to a lot of the big infrastructure development. It's been for a long time with solar and wind, and now data centers as well. And obviously, like, there's a lot of friction created in markets when you have kind of the bureaucracy of, the regulatory bodies, obviously the market operators themselves. I think that's a big thing. And then the question is, like, what is the sly roundabout way to get around that? And I think when it comes to that, like, it kind of ties back into the last panel around off-grid power development. So I think there's going to be a lot of off-grid, basically fully DC data center and generation development.
Current, there's a whole history of how AC won, but DC obviously is what solar uses directly. So other thoughts?
Yeah, I guess with more of an economics background, I kind of approach things from sort of a marginal thinking standpoint. And I think, on a go forward basis, the sort of marginal consumer of the grid will be compute. It already kind of is in a lot of venues. And I think that just an inefficiency that kind of irks me quite a bit is, if you think about the capacity of electricity plus compute that's being used to produce, I think people are now calling it slop, the AI slop these days. If you're to take some kind of arbitrary set of trillions of tokens, how many of those are actually sort of productive and useful? And I think this is kind of the model that AI has taken on, and it's sort of V1. And I think that we need sort of a bidding mechanism that has a strong indifference curve to sort of rein that in, so to speak. And for reasons that, I'll be pithy here, but I think Bitcoin's the perfect sort of indifference hurdle rate in that paradigm. And that ties in with kind of part two is, I think the marginal consumers of compute in the future period, you were talking about agents and whatnot, the marginal consumers of agents will be agents. They're not going to be instantiated by humans, these kind of workflows. And so if you think about a natural sort of neutral, globally fair settlement layer for that again is also Bitcoin. Bitcoin may not always be the numeraire within that system, but I think it needs to be the settlement layer. So as it kind of relates to the grid, I think having this kind of like cost energy aware, like response unit that's able to sort of take into account, like, if you think about like kind of the transmutation of electricity plus compute into either capital or labor, Bitcoin equals capital, agentic workflows equals labor, and it becomes a perfect sort of balancing mechanism for that.
And one way I've thought about this, it's a beautiful way of saying that, is, in real time, I have the question of, I have an electron, what do I do with it? Do I mine it? Do I use it? Do I store it? Do I sell it? And that's where I hope we're getting to with sort of free markets for electricity.
Yeah, and I guess I'll preface what I'm going to say with, there's a lot of new faces in here for me, and I've always had a kind of an arm's length relationship with the Bitcoin ecosystem. Even though I'm familiar with Bitcoin since 2013, ever since watching my college roommates do some questionable things related to Ross Ulbricht, but I've been one of those people that's only ever lost money with Bitcoin somehow. So, I think it's best for everybody that I stay at an arm's length. But my point is that, my engagements with the Bitcoin ecosystem, particularly as it relates to load integration and mining, I have a very soft spot in my heart because really I see the crypto miners as the forerunners setting the groundwork for what is potentially the most impactful topic going forward as we look to integrate AI, which is basically imbuing these wholesale markets with its own form of agency. And so if you think about like the US stock market or free markets in general, it's kind of the hive mind or the collective actions of many that creates almost like a conscious self-organizing ecosystem. And that's exactly what we need to unlock for the wholesale markets to be able to accommodate this load growth. And so all of that to say, I think, some of the two most interesting topics in this space to make the ideal grid is one, unlocking private risk taking on the load side of the equation. There's markets like ERCOT that are phenomenally efficient for unlocking private risk taking on the generation side of things or the supply side. But the load side of the equation is still really constrained by the old paradigm of centralized planning. So if you thought about, an economy working where, the supply side of the economy is free market, but then the demand side has to go through some sort of central planning process, I think it's really easy to think about how grossly inefficient that is. And so with, unlocking dispatchable loads, there's a really powerful opportunity to get everybody more of what they want with the resources we have by allowing load to assume risk. And so there's various markets in the United States working on this right now, which is just extremely exciting. And then otherwise, once you get beyond that initial stage gate of kind of imbuing this market with agency, there's additional, basically option structures that you can put on these markets, like the existing ancillary services. The problem with the ancillary services today, they're all kind of their unique buckets of types of optionality. With ancillary services, unlike energy, you're paying for the availability of a service more than you're actually paying for the utilization of that service. And so there's an opportunity to make those markets more coherent with each other, where they're kind of disjointed, discontinuous products today. And so in terms of, improving the efficacy of these ancillary service markets mixed with load private risk taking, you're basically making this optimization surface that was previously discontinuous now continuous, and that allows the market to just find what is the least cost solution for serving all this load growth going forward, and it will ultimately make the grid dream of itself, so to speak.
We said we're going to have some poetry on there. I like that.
Yeah, retweet all of that. I think for me, the big thing like that I think about is like we're talking about a lot about markets for electricity, but a lot of the maladies of the grid that we've been referring to through the morning of like backlog interconnection queues and rising delivery costs trace back to how we build physical infrastructure. So a lot of my thinking around this is more about like how do we provide market-based mechanisms to build infrastructure and use it more efficiently. I think the two major causes of this are basically like interconnection right now is entirely procedural. It's serial, right? So it's like you show up, and whether I'm a generator, basically trying to interconnect a new load, it's like a first come, first serve basis, or it's like even a first ready, first serve basis, which is like even a marginal improvement on that. And I think like now that we've been in the energy industry from a renewables perspective complaining about this for like 10 years. Now that hyperscalers and data centers are running into similar issues where, connecting things to the system has become so inflexible that it's now limiting our economic growth. It's becoming much more like clear in our head that it is essentially like the Wild West, and we're not able to like integrate resources as effectively enough. So if you look at, processes for interconnecting generation, and the lack of process around connecting new large loads, which again, we're starting to see, large load queues emerge. But in many respects, it's basically like, if you're at Microsoft and you have someone on your team that worked at, the utility, you just phone up your buddy and you kind of like can skip the line that way. It's really like the Wild West in terms of large load queue. I'd like to see a bit more like market driven and thoughtfulness in how we basically propose upgrades based on which resources are trying to connect. And then I think on the same token, the other area we could use more market thinking is the rate of return on infrastructure. So one of the things from Tyler Norris's paper, and something I've experienced firsthand from trying to sell non-wires alternative solutions to utilities, is that they don't really give a shit if the infrastructure is utilized, because their return is fixed, right? So they're going to get 10 to 12% return on their capital assets, regardless of whether the load factor is high or low. And so what that means is they have no incentive to basically build infrastructure effectively, which is why transmission planning and interconnection are these two procedural processes. And I think if we were to introduce mechanisms for taking more risk in terms of where we're building infrastructure, we would see a lot of delivery costs be reduced, and we would also see as a function of the load factor of the system increasing. So regardless of whether it's a fully off-grid system where we're essentially building away from the grid, we still have to solve these incentive problems to make sure our peripheral grids don't run into the same issues we're facing today. And then I think even if we're seeing progress in Texas, these are still the solutions I would want to be able to see, right? So it's either whether it's off-grid or we're working through the existing institutions. I think those are the two biggest problems in the industry right now.
Amazing. Preach. Yeah, preach. Let's go. You heard it here first, ladies and gentlemen. So one way that I would summarize what all of you guys said is basically more openness and transparency, which is another way of saying free markets. For those of you who don't understand, most people in the room probably understand sort of how electricity works, but it's complicated, right? And there's a reason why most people that are setting these regulations, they don't even understand what's going on, right? You have spot price markets, day ahead markets, you've got these ancillary service markets, you've got capacity markets. Then you have basically a lot of things that are called markets, but are really just central planning. One question I have for you guys, and sort of an extreme question, is it possible that we could go to pure spot price anarchy? Instead of all these capacity markets and all these things, could we just have one price for electricity? And to be clear, electricity or energy is not fungible, right? Power matters, where specifically you're going to deliver that electron. So you can have a different price for an electron depending on where that's delivered. Is that feasible? If it is, if you were building the grid from the bottoms up, how would you think about having sort of a spot price as the only driving sort of a signal? And to be clear, so that people don't think we're totally insensitive, because I am sensitive to this as well. One of the reasons you don't have pure spot price in a place like Texas is, there are some reps, the retail electricity providers that have done this, and grandma might get a bill that's $100,000 one day because it just spiked up. And we want to prevent that too. But there's probably other ways we could prevent that. So Andrew, yeah, let's start with Kyle.
Yeah, so the more I learn about, my background's in the liberal arts and everything, so I've slowly had to learn about the physics of the electricity system, and the more I learn, the more it scares me, frankly, because it's not a typical commodity. It's like a force field, right? We're all basically trying to maintain this force field at the same time, and so when we think about market terms in terms of typical commodities from other ideas, we have to realize how sensitive the existing grid is and how quickly things can black out. So I just, the more I've learned about this, the more I understand the conservatism from the utility industry on managing it. That being said, I don't know if I'm willing to be convinced wrong by everyone who's about to speak, but I don't think a pure spot market for electricity is the best idea, just because I want to be able to think about the marginal cost of producing energy, but I also want to think about the marginal cost of delivering it at any given time. And so when I think about some solutions that we could bring to the problem of basically thinking about how do we form price signals more deeply at specific points and increase more dispatchability. So essentially, if you build a substation and you want to increase the load factor as much as possible, you usually overbuild with some reserve margin. But being able to kind of auction off the deliverability rights, the right to deliver that headroom or the available headroom at that point, that's where I think there's some sort of other market mechanism that needs to come into play, where, as a data center, if you're building a substation with 3 data centers nearby, you have a curtailment stack that you're basically like paying for the right to be to not be curtailed or be curtailed, irrespective of like the cost to generate energy that's going into your system. So I think of them as like two distinct concepts, and I think that's why we need some sort of like kind of not pure electricity spot markets, but some sort of other mechanism more tailored to the infrastructure. But very, very willing to be convinced otherwise.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, it's between pure energy, spot price behavior and where the various markets are today. There's a broad spectrum. I think Texas is absolutely on the sacred path for energy only. That being said, obviously, there's kind of an asymptote on the efficacy of pure energy only dynamics. There is a kind of social stewardship responsibility that these markets need to maintain, given the fact that, if the grid trick goes down at the transmission level, it doesn't go down for somebody, it goes down for everybody. But with that said, we have developed projects in capacity market territories, but I mean, the largest productive output from capacity markets is work for lawyers to do. So it is not efficient for ultimately steering the markets to where we want to go. I think energy only is very much closer to the kind of max absolute optimal compared to other structures. But that's where ancillary services, so long as they're coherent with each other, can play a really significant role to make sure that energy pricing is dictating how people make decisions. And then there's always kind of this chain of forgiveness for any sort of real-time uncertainty to be managed with physical responses from resources. And then the last thing I'd say is just that, price contains information, which is really, really powerful if it's capturing, if there's no unpriced externalities. And so from that perspective, part of this whole, unlocking risk taking for load has to do with making sure loads are dispatchable. And by dispatchable, it means, loads are following sched. And so even if because flexibility kind of becomes a misnomer, because you can be dispatchable, but not flexible, in the sense that you will only be the dispatch of last resort, being on the very, very end of the demand or the supply curve, depending on how you look at it. And so the point is that if we have these loads in sched bidding, even if it's at the price cap, that information becomes exactly what allows the market to operate with a lot more freedom, in the sense that, okay, if you have a load that is dispatchable by sched, you can build generation on site to actually sit in between dispatching the load and responding to market pricing and congestion at the location. But because the market can rely on the load being the dispatch of last resort, meaning like, if there's infeasible ability to serve the load, the price at your location will go to whatever sufficiently incentivizes the load to curtail. That is the powerful mechanism that allows the planning paradigm to say, okay, I don't need to build the system to be, gold plated before you get online. You can come online before any upgrades, and we'll get you service eventually. But otherwise, in the meantime, you can come online and privately assume that risk based off your location. So, phenomenally powerful consequences for getting energy pricing right.
Yeah, I think I'll sort of bring again the overlay of kind of the compute market on top of this. If we think about the aggregate shape of the load on the grid, again, if we believe this conjecture that more and more of that will be driven by compute, and let's even say of the flavor of sort of Gen AI compute, then, I think what's kind of missing in my mind is the dimensionality of time being a first-class citizen in how and when to serve inference. We already see sort of, triage and routing, some offerings like OpenAI are kind of like routing lower complexity queries to, lower cost, lower quality models. So there is triage in the dimension of quality, but not on time yet. And I think in order for that to happen, and again, if we're talking about Platonic ideals, I think that latency acceptance needs to be sort of a first-class citizen when you're, the requester of inference or the requester of compute, because that then allows the provider of inference to do their own sort of bin packing in time, right? And I think that, in a lot of these grids, they have kind of these vagaries that are relatively normalized. Where in ERCOT, you've got kind of the west to east problem where, energy is being generated in the west and then Houston lights up and there's kind of this, transmission becomes kind of this daily, pickle or whatever. I think having the inference providers who will be the ones like marginally taxing the grid more and more, being able to do that sort of bin packing in time becomes kind of crucial. And I think, moreover, I would say that the current shape of the inference market is it's being sort of provisioned today, where it's this like, tokens go in the form of a prompt, and then the model provider, cues off the Shakespeare monkeys to start generating tokens immediately, is kind of just not really an economically sustainable one. I think we even see that, yesterday with OpenAI asking for a federal backstop and whatnot. So I think this is kind of the installation phase, and then we're going to, maybe have a little bit of messiness. And I think, again, time being this first class citizen in inference markets, as it shapes kind of load demand on the grid, becomes kind of the deployment phase, to use the Parisian analog there.
I think one of the key points, most important things, is the importance of price. So what a grid or a power market really needs to do is balance supply and demand, and the equilibrium of supply and demand is called the price. So when we look at like the ideal power grid, I think DC grids would solve a lot of this. It kind of reduces the need for the frequency. Regulation is a big piece of it. I think there are a lot of natural trends happening right now where you have things like demand response and distributed generation storage are kind of taking a lot of the volatility out of the market. So it's helping supply and demand balance better together. And then if you really have sort of a decentralized distributed pricing mechanism, I think that then negates the need for price caps, ancillary services, capacity markets, and things like that. And it even negates the need for any sort of interconnection or generation or load interconnection studies, because anybody building infrastructure for the grid is incentivized to have a reliable grid. Anybody who wants the grid to come down, they're going to find ways to do that, and it won't be through the study process. So again, the pricing mechanism is most important. And I think if you think about that decentralized distributed pricing mechanism, you layer onto that real-time settlements of every power transaction in the market, a la Bitcoin, and tie those settlements to a circuit breaker, for example. So if you run out of money to pay for the power, then your circuit breaker opens. I think you get to an ultimately kind of mesh network, decentralized, super reliable, super abundant power grid that would actually work.
Let's go. Let's follow up on that point. So you talk about almost like a mesh network, and you mentioned your goal is to get one day to a continent, or even I think you said world size grid, world size,
universal.
Oh baby, we're going to be talking about Dyson spheres tomorrow. Don't worry. I'm not even joking. We have a whole panel on that. But one of my heroes is Buckminster Fuller, and he had this whole concept of basically, the world size grid. Now, obviously, that's very tricky for many reasons. Politics. There's also some debate over transmission and distribution. Tamara Mez and Casey Hanmer are going to discuss, and they agree on a lot, but perhaps disagree on HVDC lines, whether that's financeable effectively. But you've talked about this. I know you've written a lot about this concept of a fractal grid. I'd love to hear you guys talk about how do you think this, and I think it's important to say evolve instead of design. How can this grid evolve such that you can go local when you need to go local, but ideally you still have markets on top of markets that are nesting such that you can have a global power grid, which, by the way, the opportunity for what that could do for world peace and having us all literally trading electrons together is that's what a lot of the Bitcoiners are aiming for, right? Is getting everyone on the same standard. How can this happen? How can this rise? Maybe we'll start with you, Andrew.
Oh, thank you.
It's a really easy one.
I mean, kind of tying back to what I said earlier in the panel, I think this trend is kind of happening naturally, where you see all these regulatory and transmission constraints on the grid today. It's kind of forcing people to think about off-grid, and not just off-grid, but off-grid at scale. So I think that's one of the next steps is you have those off-grid campuses, and if you have a cluster of 1 gigawatt campuses in West Texas, do they connect to the legacy AC grid first, or do they build high voltage DC between each other? I think that's a really interesting concept, not just there's some microgrid people in the room, not necessarily a microgrid, but like a macro grid. That's a new type of grid. I think also, especially in Texas, the current regulation, there's an avenue to do this without actually needing to have new laws or sort of change any existing laws.
So we're running a little tight on time, so I would like to hear your response to this. Kyle, if either of you guys have something burning, you can also hop in. But then I have one question to close with. So Kyle, how do we get fractal grids?
I think, one of the aspects of this is like one of the problems that I ran into through my career, just like the brief like synopsis of like why I think the form of the price signal is like one of the most important things here is like when you run a when you're convincing like a demand response asset to enroll in a flexibility program, you're getting kind of like inundated with multiple price signals. You can get, the time of use rate from the local utility. You can get wholesale market demand response programs. You can get utility demand response programs. And I think like the key thing about a fractal grid is you just need to like cut it off. You need to have one simple like market, right? And I think, I'm kind of hearing you guys talk, changing my mind about it. Like the way Western and balanced markets work actually could be a model for adding out like additional fractalness of the grid, where it is just like, you take the complexity of an existing wholesale market, and then you have like basically, say I'm building batteries and data centers behind the meter, and it's like you just have one settlement point between like, this industrial campus and the major network. And then that's essentially like you're free to run like a smaller submarket like within your industrial campus based on your different tenants. So I really think it's like the best way to do this is really like when you see more like these co-located loads going off grid as like a bridge to power solution or fully off grid and then like emerging together, you see like a lot of these like little federations looking more like little imbalanced markets between each other. But that's primarily driven by just like the slowness of the legacy system to basically integrate those loads and the new generation in an economic way. So I think it's about like, building on the periphery to do a lot of like co-location on-site generation and load. And like as they start to connect with one another and to each other, that's when you begin to see more like, imbalanced market type constructs where it's like, it's simple. It's like you have one settlement point. It's like the bus that connects my microgrid or my, community grid to the major network. And that's like the major form of price signal we'd be concerned about.
I love it. Final question, and I know this is something all of you guys have thought about. John, you talk about this a lot. One of my obsessions is the evolution of digital life. If you want to hear a crazy podcast, I did a rip with my buddy Drew Bansel talking about how Bitcoin is digital ATP, digital metabolism, a lot of crazy things there. Private keys stored in secure enclaves on servers. There's some wild sci-fi there. It's quite cool. And we actually have a real sci-fi author in the room, so maybe you like this one, guys. But my last question for all of you guys, and maybe 50 response on the time, is what does it look like for, to your point, John, increasingly humans are becoming rounding errors. Like the marginal like spender on the grid is about to be AI. I mean, it's just, it is what it is. I'm not saying it's a good thing or a bad thing. What does it look like for this platonic ideal of a grid to be designed for the new digital life forms that are coming? Specifically, one thing I think a lot about is I know there are some Nostr people in the room. Do we got some Nostr fans out there? Yeah. Is what does it look like for potentially this, these life forms to have one standard for identity, public-private key identity and communication? I think a lot about what does a grid look like when it's nostrified, but I'll throw that out to y'all.
Yeah, I mean, I think historically, if you look at sort of humanity through a civilizational lens, there's kind of the competing factors of production. If you think through Marx, Ricardo, Schumpeter, even more modern, and the traditional factors are sort of capital, labor, and land, right? And I think, I don't know what you want to call this new thing, but I think this sort of standardized unit of capacitive electricity plus compute becomes kind of the primary factor of the go-forward economy. And I think that can be routed toward either sort of capital equivalents in Bitcoin or labor equivalents in sort of an agentic workflow. And I think what's tricky in there is there's not really persistent identity. It's really just these ephemeral requesters. And so I think the way that, and I don't necessarily love the term agent, but if we want to sort of, anthropomorphize agents or kind of talking to agents, where really an agent's just a runtime call on a model, right? But it's, which again could be that model itself, and the serving infrastructure for that model could all be interchangeable and fungible to a degree. So holding that aside, I think that kind of the settlement mechanism of these sort of trustless agents, to use that term again, will involve basically over collateralized bonding, where Bitcoin's the settlement layer. So that's a longer kind of diatribe, but when you have like true trustless settlement of compute at scale, I think you're going to have over collateralized bonding of Bitcoin, where actually the server of the compute posts the bond. And basically that gets sort of like unlocked in escrow via some Oracle mechanism. I think that Oracle mechanism's a tricky I think really that's probably down to like runtime attestations versus the quality of the output. But anyway, I'm droning on now, so I'll shut up.
Stay tuned. I believe John and I will do an Ideas from the Edge. Any last thoughts on this agentic grid?
Yeah, I would just say that to sound like a broken record, just having private actors be able to assume their own risk and make their own decisions is the way to move forward with imperfect information. And that really helps kind of assemble the digital being in the sense that, it's not it goes beyond just electricity. We should be co-optimizing fiber network with electricity with really, there's also a phenomenal amount of thermal mass that comes from building these gigawatt scale data centers. So in a perfectly co-optimized world, we would have these resources around major load centers and then basically, using the low grade heat to offer, heating for free to residents. And I think that, the last thing I'll say is that a lot of the times, if you want a positive socialized externality, that often just falls out of private actors seeking their own initiatives. And so, I think that's why we have such a great capacity as the United States for social welfare and programs like that, is because of the phenomenal strength of our private markets. And so if we want the most socialized benefit from our systems, we want all these private actors getting after it.
Beautiful. Gentlemen, can we get everyone a round of applause for these guys? Told you there's some big brains up here.